Broadway was not always a symbol of light. Before the glow of marquees and the sound of applause, it was a rough path cutting through the island of Manhattan, an old Native American trail widened by Dutch settlers. No one then could imagine it would one day become the heartbeat of American theater. In the 18th century, New York was still growing, its streets muddy and narrow, its people restless from the tensions of colonial rule. Entertainment came in fragments, small gatherings, traveling performers, and makeshift stages. The idea of a theater was met with suspicion. To many it was sinful, wasteful, or English, and thus un-American. In 1750, two British actors, Walter Murray and Thomas Keane, dared to defy that suspicion. They opened a small theater company in a building near Maiden Lane. It was called the Nassau Street Theater, and it became the first venue in New York where real plays were performed for paying audiences. The shows were mostly Shakespeare and English dramas, bold for a colony still unsure of its identity. The audience was divided. Merchants and British loyalists filled the seats. Religious groups and moral reformers called it indecent. This tension set the tone for the next century. Theater in New York would always have to fight for its right to exist. Then came the Revolutionary War. Theaters closed, actors fled or joined loyalist troops. When the British Army occupied New York in 1776, soldiers used theaters for propaganda plays. When the war ended, many saw theaters as reminders of oppression. The stage went dark again. But New York was changing fast. By the early 1800s, it became a hub for trade and immigration. People wanted entertainment, laughter, music, escape. That desire brought the stage back to life. New playhouses opened, such as the Park Theater, built in 1798, near what is now City Hall. It was elegant, with chandeliers and velvet seats, a place where high society gathered. Yet behind the curtains, struggle brewed. Theaters relied on British plays and actors. American writers were ignored. Local performers earned little. And the audiences were unpredictable, shouting, drinking, and throwing objects when displeased. Sometimes fights broke out mid-performance. In 1821, a small theater on Mercer Street became a quiet revolution. It was called the African Grove Theater, founded by William Henry Brown, a free black man. It was the first black-owned theater in the United States. There, African-American actors performed Shakespeare and original works for black audiences, a bold act in a racially divided city. White critics dismissed it, police raided it, audiences were harassed, but it stood for something larger, that the stage in America could belong to anyone. That idea would echo across centuries. As the 1830s arrived, the heart of theater began to move uptown, toward Broadway. The street was wide and busy, filled with carriages, merchants, and immigrants. It became the perfect artery for culture and commerce to mix. But the stage remained chaotic. Rival theaters competed for audiences, each promising louder, flashier acts. Managers battled debt and corruption. Critics mocked the vulgarity of popular shows. Yet, behind the noise, a new spirit was forming. American theater was breaking free from its British roots. Then came one of the darkest moments in early theater history, the Astor Place riot of 1849. It wasn't more than a riot. It was a battle between classes and nations. Two actors stood at the center, William Charles Macready, a refined English performer, and Edwin Forrest, a fiery American. Both were performing Shakespeare in rival theaters. Their fans turned the rivalry into war. On May 10, 1849, crowds gathered outside the Astor Place Opera House to protest Macready's performance. They threw stones, stormed the building, and clashed with police. When the smoke cleared, at least 22 people were dead. The riot shocked the city. It showed how deep the divisions ran between rich and poor, English and American, elite and working class. Theater was no longer just entertainment. It was identity, pride, and politics. After the riot, theaters became more cautious. Managers built walls between classes, literally. They introduced assigned seating, raised ticket prices, and tried to control the crowds. The working-class spirit that once filled the seats was slowly pushed out. Yet the stage survived. It adapted. And soon a new generation of visionaries would arrive. Men and women who would turn the dusty street of Broadway into a world of light. But that transformation would not come easily. The next 50 years would test Broadway's soul, between art and money, taste and morality, progress and scandal. The curtain was rising, but the struggles were only beginning. The mid-19th century brought noise, smoke, and ambition to New York. Broadway was no longer a quiet street of merchants. It was alive, filled with carriages, lamplighters, and the hum of a growing city. But in that noise, theater was fighting for survival. After the Astor Place riot, managers feared chaos. They turned theaters into controlled, respectable spaces. Yet respectability came with a price. The working class that once filled the benches could no longer afford tickets. The theater became a mirror of society, bright for some, closed for many. Still, the crowds wanted entertainment, so a new form rose from the streets: minstrel shows. These were traveling acts mixing music, comedy, and racial caricature. By today's understanding, they were deeply offensive, but in their time, they were a dominant force. Minstrelsy shaped early American performance, introducing song and dance routines that later evolved into vaudeville. One of the first organized troupes was the Virginia Minstrels, performing in New York in 1843. They popularized the banjo, tambourine, and early forms of musical storytelling. Yet beneath their success lay the pain of racism. White actors in blackface mocking black culture, while real black performers were pushed aside. Still, the African Grove spirit lived on. A few black artists continued to perform in small halls and cabarets, keeping their art alive against all odds. Their influence would resurface decades later when the Broadway musical began to take shape. By the 1850s, the theater district began drifting north. As New York expanded, land prices downtown soared, and theaters followed the crowds moving uptown. By the 1860s, most playhouses clustered around Union Square, an early version of what would later become Times Square. This move changed everything. Theaters now stood beside restaurants, hotels, and shops, a social center. And into this center came the first signs of glamour. One name stood out: Laura Keene. A British-born actress and theater manager, she broke barriers by running her own company and managing her own theater. In 1856, she opened Laura Keene's Varieties on Broadway. It became known for refined performances and the debut of new American works. Keene's most famous play would be remembered for tragedy: Our American Cousin, the play being performed at Ford's Theater in Washington when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Keene herself was on stage that night. She rushed to Lincoln's box, her dress stained with his blood. Her name was forever tied to one of America's darkest moments. Back in New York, theater evolved again. The Civil War years brought uncertainty, but also a hunger for laughter. Audiences wanted escape from grief. Light comedies, melodramas, and variety acts filled the stages. Then came vaudeville, the bridge between the crude minstrel show and the polished Broadway spectacle. Vaudeville was built on one idea: something for everyone. It mixed singers, magicians, dancers, jugglers, and comedians into one show. Families could attend without scandal. It was clean, colorful, and bursting with energy. The first vaudeville houses appeared in the 1880s. Among their pioneers was Tony Pastor, often called the father of vaudeville. His theater on 14th Street welcomed working-class audiences while keeping the content wholesome. Pastor's formula worked. He proved that entertainment could be profitable without being vulgar. But not all theaters shared that standard. Many others, including the Bowery theaters, still catered to rougher crowds. Actors were heckled, drunks shouted, and managers bribed police to keep their doors open. The line between art and survival was thin. Meanwhile, the technology of the city was changing everything. In 1880, the Edison Electric Illuminating Company brought electric light to Broadway. By the 1990s, theaters began replacing gas lamps with electric bulbs. The glow was steady, safe, and bright. Audiences marveled as the streets lit up. It was this transformation that gave Broadway its future name, the Great White Way. For the first time, theaters could shine through the night, their names gleaming across the street. Light became identity. Theaters competed to outshine each other, and electric signs became symbols of power and success. One of the grandest theaters of the time was the Metropolitan Opera House, opened in 1883. It attracted New York's elite, families such as the Vanderbilts and Astors. Here, opera became a mark of social status. Meanwhile, smaller theaters across Broadway served immigrants, laborers, and dreamers. This contrast, the high-class opera house and the noisy vaudeville stage, defined Broadway's dual soul. It was both luxury and struggle. Behind every polished curtain were unpaid actors, failed playwrights, and musicians chasing rent. Yet, out of that chaos, something new was forming: the American musical. Its roots came from vaudeville songs, European operettas, and the rhythms of immigrant communities. By the 1890s, audiences wanted stories told through music, not just songs added between acts. One of the earliest attempts was The Black Crook, 1866, staged at Niblo's Garden on Broadway. It combined drama, dance, and spectacle, with a cast of ballerinas and grand sets. Many historians call it the first Broadway-style musical. It ran for more than a year, an incredible feat at the time. But it also stirred controversy. Critics called it immoral because of the dancers' costumes. Religious groups protested outside the theater. The managers ignored them. Ticket sales soared. The success of The Black Crook revealed something essential about Broadway. Controversy sold. From that moment, theater owners knew that moral outrage could fill seats. It became a pattern, one that would shape Broadway's history for decades. As the century drew to a close, Broadway was shining brighter than ever before. Electric lights glowed, streetcars rattled, tourists began to visit just to see the theaters. But behind the glow, cracks were forming. Actors struggled under poor pay and harsh conditions. Playwrights had no control over their work. Producers rewrote scripts freely. The industry was dominated by a few powerful men, and artists had little voice. The tension was growing, quietly. The next century would bring both triumph and rebellion. Broadway would soon face its greatest challenge yet, a battle between art and business, creativity and control. The Street of Light was ready for its next act. The dawn of the 20th century found Broadway glowing brighter than ever. Every corner flashed with signs, every theater promised a miracle. But behind those lights, power had shifted, and not everyone was happy about it. By 1900, a group of businessmen had quietly taken control of most of Broadway's theaters. They called themselves the Theatrical Syndicate. Led by Charles Frohman, A. Heyman, Mark Claw, A. L. Erlanger, Samuel Nixon, and Fred Zimmerman, this syndicate operated with one goal: profit. They owned or booked nearly every major theater in the country. Actors and producers who refused to work with them were shut out. Their contracts were strict, their influence absolute. For theater artists, it was both security and prison. The syndicate ensured steady work, but stripped away independence. Small companies collapsed. Touring groups had to obey or disappear. Broadway had become an empire of businessmen, not dreamers. Yet resistance was growing. In 1910, a fiery producer named David Belasco stood up to them. Known for his realism on stage and perfectionist detail, Belasco refused to surrender his artistic control. He built his own theater, the Belasco Theater, where he managed everything from lighting to costumes. His rebellion inspired others. Then came the Schubert brothers, Sam, Lee, and Jacob J. Schubert. Immigrants from Syracuse, they began as theater managers in small towns and worked their way up. By challenging the syndicate's monopoly, they built a rival empire. They bought theaters, funded new shows, and offered better terms to performers. By 1915, the Schuberts had broken the syndicate's hold. Broadway's future was open again, but it came with new rivalries. Money still ruled, but now art had room to breathe. In this period, theater itself was transforming. The 1900s brought new audiences, immigrants, women, and working families seeking escape from factory life. The stories on stage began to reflect that diversity. Writers explored social themes, moral conflicts, and the shifting rhythm of modern life. Yet censorship shadowed every step. New York City had morality laws, and the police could close any show deemed immoral. Producers had to pay fines, rewrite scripts, or move performances underground. One of the most famous battles came in 1927 with the play Sex, written, produced, and performed by Mae West. Critics attacked it as scandalous, but audiences flocked to see it. Eventually, West was arrested and sentenced to jail for corrupting public morals. Her defiance made headlines across the nation. But censorship didn't stop with West. Earlier, in 1906, the city banned Salome, Oscar Wilde's play about forbidden desire, calling it blasphemous. Producers who tried to stage it faced police raids. Theater was constantly at war with moral authority. Still, art pushed forward. In 1915, Eugene O'Neill emerged as a new voice. His plays, staged at the Provincetown Players, brought raw realism and emotion to the stage. He wrote about loneliness, addiction, and human struggle, subjects that Broadway had long avoided. By the 1920s, O'Neill's work won the Pulitzer Prize and redefined what American drama could be. His success proved that Broadway could be more than spectacle. It could be truth. The 1910s also marked the birth of actors' unions. Working conditions were brutal. Performers had no job security, long hours, and low pay. Managers replaced them without notice. Then came a breaking point, the Actors' Equity Strike of 1919. Thousands of actors walked out, shutting down nearly every theater on Broadway. They demanded fair contracts, rest periods, and payment for rehearsals. At first, theater owners mocked them, but after 2 weeks of closed shows, empty seats, and rising public support, the producers gave in. The strike was a victory for labor and marked a turning point in theater history. From that day forward, actors had a union, Actors' Equity Association, and a voice that could no longer be ignored. As art gained power, Broadway's audiences changed too. The Roaring Twenties brought jazz, dance, and color. The first great musicals appeared, blending humor, story, and song into something uniquely American. George M. Cohan led the charge. A composer, actor, and playwright, Cohan gave Broadway its rhythm. His songs, Give My Regards to Broadway and Yankee Doodle Dandy, captured the city's restless energy. But not all stories were light. In 1921, Shuffle Along, created by Noble Sissle and E.B. Blake, broke barriers as one of the first all-black Broadway musicals. It introduced jazz to the stage and launched the careers of black performers, including Josephine Baker. Its success stunned critics who doubted that a black production could attract white audiences. Yet racism lingered. Black artists were praised on stage, but excluded off it, barred from many theaters and hotels. Shuffle Along's triumph revealed both progress and the boundaries that still held.
Meanwhile, technology was changing entertainment forever. In the late 1920s, motion pictures, now with sound, began to draw crowds away from live theater. Broadway producers feared the worst. Some theaters closed, others converted into cinemas. Actors began to leave for Hollywood, chasing new fame under the camera's glare. Still, Broadway held its ground. The theater offered something film could not: human presence, the electric pulse between actor and audience. But the balance was fragile. By the end of the 1920s, the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through the city. Producers went bankrupt, theaters dimmed their lights, unemployment rose among actors. For a moment, it seemed the magic of Broadway might fade away. Yet history would not let it die. Out of the Great Depression would rise new voices, new experiments, and the most creative period in Broadway's history. The curtain was ready to rise on the Golden Age. When the 1930s began, New York was quiet in a way it hadn't been for decades. The crash of 1929 had shaken every street. Theater doors closed. Marquees went dark. Many actors left the city. Producers lost fortunes overnight. Broadway, once the city's brightest jewel, now faced ruin. But art does not vanish in silence. In those dark years, new voices began to rise, not from wealth but from survival. The Depression had stripped away illusions, and audiences craved truth again. They wanted laughter, but they also wanted to see themselves, their fears, their strength, their humanity. One of the first shows to capture that feeling was Of Thee I Sing, 1931, by George and Ira Gershwin. It was a musical satire about politics, but its humor carried real pain. It became the first musical to win the Pulitzer Prize for drama, proving that Broadway could still lead the nation's conversation. Then came the Federal Theater Project, launched in 1935 under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It gave jobs to thousands of unemployed actors, writers, and directors. For a brief, shining period, the stage belonged to the people. The project produced over 1,000 plays across America, from Harlem to Harlem on the Hudson. One of its branches, the Negro Theater Unit, produced works by black playwrights and brought serious attention to African American stories. For the first time, racial identity was explored with dignity and honesty on major stages. But controversy followed. Critics accused the program of promoting radical ideas. Under political pressure, Congress shut it down in 1939. Still, its legacy lived. It had given the stage a conscience. Then came World War II, and with it new energy. The war changed everything, not just politics, but art itself. The country needed hope, and Broadway answered. In 1943, Rodgers and Hammerstein released Oklahoma. It was revolutionary. The story, music, and dance worked as one, no longer separate acts, but a single narrative. This was the birth of the modern American musical. The show's success was staggering, running over 2,000 performances. The formula worked. From that moment, Broadway entered its golden age. Between 1943 and 1960, the street filled with unforgettable names: Lerner and Loewy, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Leonard Bernstein, and many more. Each show carried a unique voice, yet all shared the same heartbeat: optimism, rhythm, and emotion. Audiences lined up for South Pacific, My Fair Lady, The King and I, Guys and Dolls, and West Side Story. These productions didn't just entertain, they shaped the culture, reflecting both the dreams and divisions of post-war America. But under that glow, tensions brewed. Censorship had changed form. Instead of police raids, it now came from social expectation. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, formed during the Cold War, investigated artists suspected of communist ties. Many playwrights, composers, and actors were blacklisted. Some fled to Europe. Others changed their names to keep working. Fear spread quietly through the dressing rooms. One of the most targeted was Mark Blitzstein, composer of The Cradle Will Rock, 1937, a politically charged musical about labor and corruption. On opening night, the government tried to shut it down. The cast, banned from performing, stood in the audience and sang their lines from the seats. The crowd erupted in support. It became one of the most legendary nights in Broadway history, a symbol of resistance.
The 1940s and 50s also saw the continued struggle over race. While shows such as Porgy and Bess, 1935, and Showboat, 1927, included black characters, segregation remained widespread. Black artists had to use separate entrances and dressing rooms. Critics praised their talent, but denied them equal credit or pay. Still, progress flickered. A Raisin in the Sun, 1959, written by Lorraine Hansberry, became the first Broadway play by a black woman. It told the story of a working-class black family dreaming of a better life. It was raw, honest, and groundbreaking. The audience's reaction was electric, applause mixed with tears. Broadway had finally confronted America's most painful truth on its biggest stage. Behind the scenes, another quiet revolution was shaping the art: the rise of method acting. Imported from Russian techniques and popularized by the group theater and Lee Strasberg, it brought realism to the stage. Actors lived their roles emotionally, breaking away from the exaggerated style of earlier decades. Stars like Marlon Brando and Jessica Tandy brought a new intensity that would influence generations. Meanwhile, the design of theaters changed too. Architects rebuilt old venues with modern lighting and sound systems. Theaters such as the Majestic, Schubert, and Winter Garden became landmarks of design and acoustics. Each carried its own personality, from the intimacy of the booth to the grandeur of the palace. The 1950s brought television, another threat, another challenge. Families stayed home, glued to screens instead of theater seats. Attendance dropped. Producers worried the magic was fading again, but some saw opportunity. They began adapting Broadway shows for TV, reaching millions who could never afford a ticket. Through it all, Broadway's heart kept beating, steady, proud, defiant. Each decade had tested it: wars, censorship, politics, technology. And still, the curtain rose. By 1960, Broadway had become more than a street. It was an idea that art could survive against anything, that stories could unite a nation, that performance could mirror life in all its light and shadow. The Golden Age had given the world masterpieces, but it had also left questions. Could Broadway stay pure in a world ruled by money and fame? Could it remain the voice of truth in an era of comfort and control? The answers would come in the years ahead, when rebellion, change, and chaos would once again challenge the meaning of art itself. By the 1960s, Broadway was both a dream and a warning. The lights still shone, but many wondered how long they would last. Television had arrived in every home, films were breaking box office records, and audiences were changing faster than the theaters could adapt. The golden age of Broadway, filled with melodic optimism and grand productions, was giving way to something more uncertain, raw, experimental, and uneasy. The decade began with a strange duality. On one hand, shows like The Sound of Music and Hello, Dolly filled theaters night after night, celebrating old-fashioned joy and spectacle. On the other, the world outside was erupting. Civil rights marches, Vietnam protests, and countercultural revolutions were transforming the American conscience. The streets of New York were filled with voices demanding change, but Broadway seemed caught between eras. Behind the scenes, a quiet crisis was brewing. Production costs were rising fast, union wages increased, and theater maintenance became more expensive. Ticket prices climbed, pushing away the working-class audiences who had once filled the seats. Meanwhile, television networks began broadcasting musical specials, giving people the Broadway experience without leaving their living rooms.
By the mid-1960s, producers felt trapped. They needed to reinvent Broadway to survive. Out of that pressure came a wave of daring experiments. Hair debuted in 1967, breaking every rule Broadway once followed. It used rock music, onstage nudity, and political defiance to capture the energy of youth rebellion. For the first time, a Broadway stage mirrored the raw pulse of American life outside the theater walls. Critics were divided, but younger audiences flocked to it. Broadway had found its new language, provocative, loud, and unapologetically honest. Still, beneath this artistic rebirth, the business was collapsing. Times Square, once known for its theaters and excitement, fell into decay. Crime rose. Pornographic cinemas replaced legitimate playhouses. Tourists avoided the district after dark. Many historic theaters were either closed or demolished. In 1967, the Majestic, the Astor, and several others faced threats of redevelopment. The very foundation of Broadway seemed to be crumbling under economic pressure and urban decline. Yet out of that darkness came resilience. In 1968, 1776 opened, offering a thoughtful retelling of America's founding. A year later, Company and Cabaret broke new ground, bringing psychological realism and modern storytelling to the musical form. Stephen Sondheim emerged as a voice who could bridge intellect and emotion, blending deep narrative with haunting music. His work became a symbol of Broadway's evolution, proving that it could mature without losing its edge. By the early 1970s, the world of entertainment had shifted dramatically. Hollywood had claimed the spectacle. Rock concerts had captured youth culture. Broadway needed a new identity. That answer came from the streets. Off-Broadway and off-Broadway theaters flourished during this time. Smaller, cheaper venues that gave unknown writers and performers a voice. Plays such as The Fantastics and A Chorus Line began in these modest spaces before conquering the main stage. A Chorus Line in particular marked a historic moment in 1975. Created from real interviews with dancers, it stripped away the illusion of show business and revealed the vulnerability behind the spotlight. Audiences wept, cheered, and recognized themselves in the performers' struggles. It became one of the longest-running musicals in Broadway history and proved that authenticity, not extravagance, could move people most. But the road to revival was not easy. The economic recession of the 1970s hit New York hard. Crime soared, tourism dropped, and theaters fought to keep their doors open. Theaters that once stood as symbols of hope now faced empty seats. The Schubert Organization, one of Broadway's biggest theater owners, faced bankruptcy. The future looked bleak. Still, in the midst of decay, creative brilliance refused to fade. Sondheim continued to push boundaries with Follies in 1971, A Little Night Music in 1973, and Sweeney Todd in 1979, proving that the Broadway musical could be both art and entertainment. Meanwhile, Chicago in 1975 brought sharp satire and dark humor to the stage, showing that audiences still craved bold storytelling. Then, something unexpected happened. As New York City neared bankruptcy in 1975, a wave of preservationists began fighting to protect the theaters themselves. The demolition of the Morosco and Hellenes theaters sparked outrage among artists and the public. These movements would later lead to the establishment of the Theater District Preservation Plan, which saved dozens of historic venues from destruction. It was a quiet but powerful act of defiance, a collective belief that Broadway was worth saving. By the late 1970s, the lights on Broadway flickered once more, not as bright as before, but steady enough to guide a new generation. The combination of creative rebellion, survival instincts, and community support kept the theater alive when everything else seemed lost. When Evita opened in 1979, it signaled a shift toward large-scale, global productions. It also hinted at what was to come in the next decade, the arrival of international mega-musicals that would dominate Broadway in the 1980s. But for those who lived through the 1960 to 1980 era, Broadway was not just a business or an art form. It was a battlefield of identity, endurance, and rebirth. The curtain had fallen many times in those years, but it always rose again. Every collapse revealed another chance for reinvention. Every struggle left behind a deeper appreciation of what theater meant to New York. And when the lights glowed once more across Times Square, the city knew that Broadway, scarred, humbled, but unbroken, would never truly fade.